Millions woke up driven by New Year's resolutions. By February, 8 out of 10 will have given up. These are not modern failures, they are echoes of 4,000-year-old rituals built on debt, divine threats, and public shame. The disturbing truth? Resolutions were designed for guilt and control, not hope. What if your yearly struggle is not about self-improvement at all, but ancient obedience you never consented to? If you are ready for the hidden origins and the system profiting from your failure, subscribe now. What comes next rewrites everything you have been told. In ancient Babylon, the new year arrived not with celebration, but with anxiety. Each spring, as the Akitu festival stretched for 12 tense days, every family in the city faced a reckoning. Temples filled with worshippers, farmers, craftsmen, merchants, each one carrying the weight of promises made to the gods. These were not hopeful resolutions. They were binding oaths: pay back your debts, return the tools you borrowed, asladalba what you owe before the barley harvest. The stakes were clear. If you kept your word, the gods might bless your crops and grant you another year of prosperity. If you failed, the consequences could be devastating. Cuneiform tablets from the period reveal a world where economic survival depended on divine favor. The temple was more than a house of worship. It was the city's vault, its bank, and its court. Priests acted as both spiritual guides and enforcers. They tracked debts, mediated disputes, and led rituals to ensure that promises were honored. During Akitu, the king himself knelt before the statue of Marduk, Babylon's chief god, in a ritual of public humiliation. The high priest would strike the king's face, demanding tears as proof of sincerity. Only then would Marduk be appeased, and only then would the city's fate for the year be written. For ordinary people, the pressure was relentless. Breaking a vow meant more than social embarrassment. The Babylonians believed that the gods would punish not just the offender, but their entire household. A failed promise could bring drought, failed harvests, or even the loss of a family's future. Hymns from the era plead for mercy. Though my crimes be numerous, clear my debt. Though my sins be sevenfold, let your heart be calmed. The language of sin and debt was inseparable. These rituals were never about self-improvement. They were about restoring order in a world ruled by unpredictable gods and fragile crops. The Akitu festival was a negotiation: pay what you owe, confess what you've taken, and maybe, just maybe, the gods will spare you. The entire city moved in lockstep, watched by priests, judged by kings, haunted by the threat of divine abandonment. This was the original New Year's resolution, a system built on fear, obligation, and the knowledge that failure could haunt your family for generations. The calendar reset was not a fresh start, but a reminder: your life, your land, your future all depended on promises you could not afford to break. In Rome, the promise of a new year became a matter of state. By 153 BCE, a single calendar adjustment changed not just the date, but the entire purpose of the ritual. The Roman Senate, facing a military crisis in distant Hispania, ordered the consuls, Rome's highest officials, to take office on January 1st. This was no accident of paperwork. It gave Rome's leaders a 2-month head start for raising armies, collecting taxes, and planning campaigns before the spring fighting season. From that year on, January 1st was not just the start of the year, it was the official launch of Roman power. But the day belonged to Janus, the two-faced god who watched both the past and the future. His image stood over city gates and temple doors, a silent reminder that every decision opened one path and closed another. Romans offered honey and wine at his altar, hoping for a year of smooth transitions. On the calends of January, citizens and officials alike made public vows, vota, to Janus, promising good conduct and loyalty. These were not private hopes scribbled in a diary. They were civic contracts spoken aloud in the forum, binding each person not just to the gods, but to the machinery of the state. The symbolism ran deep. Janus looked back at the chaos of the old year, wars, failures, debts, and forward to the challenges ahead. The calendar itself became a tool of control. Julius Caesar's reform in 46 BCE, the Julian calendar, locked January 1st in place as the fixed start of the year. No more drifting months or lost days. The empire ran on schedule, and so did its rituals. The opening of Janus's temple doors signaled Rome's readiness for whatever came next, whether it was a new harvest or a new war. For generals and senators, these vows were more than tradition. They were a public rehearsal for the campaigns and political battles to come. The city's fate, its laws, even its armies, all hinged on the promises made that day. Breaking a vow to Janus risked not just personal misfortune, but the wrath of the gods and the suspicion of fellow citizens. The line between spiritual renewal and political loyalty blurred until they were one and the same. What began as a seasonal rite shifted into a fixed civic contract. The power of the calendar, the weight of public oaths, and the ever-watchful gaze of Janus turned New Year's promises into instruments of Roman order. The ritual was no longer about survival in the fields. It was about obedience, discipline, and the unbroken march of empire. In medieval Europe, the arrival of the new year was not a time for celebration, but for confession and fear. Church bells called entire villages to gather in cold stone chapels where the air was thick with incense and anxiety. The turning of the calendar was a spiritual test, and the rituals that marked it were designed to expose every flaw. Priests stood at the altar reading from penitential manuals that cataloged sins in punishing detail, envy, idleness, broken promises, and they demanded public admission. It was not enough to feel regret in private. Repentance had to be witnessed, spoken aloud, and measured out in acts of penance. For the nobility, the pressure took a different form. On New Year's Day, knights assembled in grand halls for the peacock vow, a ritual chronicled by Jean Froissart in the 14th century. Before a roasted peacock, symbol of pride and immortality, each knight renewed his oath to uphold chivalry and confess his failures. These declarations were not whispers in the confessional. They were performed before lords, ladies, and fellow warriors, binding each man's honor to the eyes of the court. To break such a vow was to risk not only personal shame, but the loss of one's place in the social order. For ordinary people, the most haunting rituals unfolded as the old year slipped into the new. Watch night vigils kept entire communities awake through the darkness of December 31st. The Church taught that this was a night for vigilance, for prayer and fasting, as a defense against the temptations that came with pagan revelry. Legends whispered that spiritual danger lurked for those who let their guard down. Falling asleep was not just laziness, it was an invitation for sin to creep in, a failure to keep watch over one's soul. The threat of damnation was never far from mind. Medieval sermons warned that negligence on this night could stain the conscience for the year to come. The rituals were relentless, and the consequences for failure were severe. Those who faltered in their vows faced public penance, fasting, wearing sackcloth, or standing at the church door in shame. Broken resolutions were not private disappointments. They were wounds to the community, reminders that the price of forgiveness was constant vigilance. The new year began not with hope, but with the heavy weight of guilt, reinforced by the very institutions that promised salvation. By the dawn of the 19th century, the new year brought not just prayers or penance, but a fresh commercial opportunity. In bustling Victorian London and New York, newspapers and periodicals began to print lists of suggested resolutions each January. These were not commandments from priests or kings, they were invitations couched in the polite language of self-improvement. But behind the optimism, a new kind of pressure emerged. Diaries from the era, written in careful script, reveal a private struggle. People confessed their failures not to the church, but to themselves, recording promises like "be more industrious," "lose weight," or "improve my character." The goals were vague, the standards impossibly high. Advice columns and self-help manuals multiplied, each promising a better life if only the reader tried harder. Samuel Smiles, whose 1859 bestseller Self-Help became a cultural phenomenon, insisted that character could be forged by sheer willpower. Publishers seized on this appetite for personal reform, churning out annual guides and moral tracts. Each year, the cycle repeated: new books, new promises, new disappointments. Failure was not a flaw in the system, it was the fuel that kept it running. Every broken resolution meant another chance to buy the next guide, another reason to seek advice, another year of striving for an ever-shifting ideal. Social standing became tied to the performance of self-discipline. Victorian etiquette manuals warned that failing in one's resolutions reflected poorly on the family's honor. The shame of falling short was no longer enforced by race or public penance, but by the silent judgment of one's own handwriting and the whispered gossip of neighbors. In this world, guilt became a private burden, and the market was ready to profit from it. Publishers and advice columnists, early masters of the guilt economy, understood that the promise of transformation was more valuable than the achievement itself. The system thrived on perpetual inadequacy, selling hope in January and regret by February. The self-help industry did not set out to engineer failure, but it learned quickly that disappointment was good for business. The cycle of vague resolutions, inevitable lapses, and renewed buying became a fixture of modern life. The ritual of January promises had shifted from communal survival to personal branding, but the engine remained the same: keep striving, keep failing, and keep coming back for more. Every January, the self-improvement economy roars to life. Gym chains, wellness apps, and productivity platforms prepare for their biggest windfall of the year. Memberships surge, up to 12% across the fitness industry, fueled by the promise of a new you. But behind the glossy ads and motivational slogans, a different reality takes shape. Most of these new members will vanish before spring. 8 out of 10 will quit by March, their payments still quietly rolling in. Executives in boardrooms track this churn like clockwork. Investor reports from major gym chains forecast the annual spike and the inevitable drop-off. The business model does not depend on your transformation, it depends on your hope. Facilities sell far more memberships than they could ever accommodate at once, banking on the knowledge that most people will stop coming before the equipment gets crowded. It is not just gyms. The $10 billion self-improvement market counts on January's wave of optimism and February's flood of regret. Diet books, wellness apps, and subscription coaching programs see their highest sales in the first weeks of the year. Each failed attempt becomes next year's customer. The cycle is so predictable that fitness apps now mark January 19th as Quitter's Day, sending reminders and offers to lure back the fallen. This is not accidental. The entire system is engineered to profit from broken promises. The more impossible the goal, the more likely you are to try again next year. Every abandoned vow is a future sale. The market does not punish failure, it feeds on it. What was once a communal ritual of renewal has become an annual harvest of disappointment. The calendar turns, the marketing resets, and the cycle begins again. The only thing that changes is the price of hope. Every January, millions step into gyms, open new journals, and download apps, certain that this year will be different. But the pressure to succeed isn't just commercial, it is psychological, and it is ancient. Rituals that once demanded public oaths or priestly forgiveness have migrated inward. The modern mind polices itself, replaying the same cycle of hope, failure, and guilt that once echoed through Babylonian temples and medieval churches. Behavioral economists have studied this pattern for decades. When resolutions inevitably break, statistics show 80% will fail by February. Most people don't blame the system, they blame themselves. The shame doesn't end at disappointment, it becomes fuel for the next round of purchases. A failed gym routine turns into a new fitness tracker. A missed writing goal means another productivity app. The cycle is profitable because it's personal. Each lapse feels like a private flaw, not a predictable outcome engineered by centuries of tradition and modern marketing. This self-blame loop isn't accidental. The language of resolutions, be better, fix yourself, start fresh, echoes the confessions and penances of earlier eras. But now, the judge and the jury live inside the mind. The market counts on this. Industry data reveals that repeat customers are the backbone of the self-improvement economy, not the success stories. Every abandoned goal is a future sale. For 4,000 years, the machinery of guilt has shifted forms but never stopped running. What began as a way to appease gods or kings now operates as an invisible script, written into the routines of daily life. The pressure to improve, to redeem past failures, to buy a second chance, these are not signs of personal weakness. They are the echoes of a system designed to keep you coming back, year after year, chasing a version of yourself that was never meant to arrive. Today, an industry worth $10 billion banks on your failure, not your growth. As resolution season resets next year, the cycle of guilt and profit continues unless you choose to break it. The real power is not in a vow, but in questioning who benefits when you do not succeed. Inherited shame only survives if we keep playing along. What if this year the ritual stops with you?